The story you are about to hear may contain detailed descriptions of intense violence. It will certainly be worse than fiction. Hello, my name is Les, and this is the Worse Than Fiction podcast. Thank you for joining me as we take a look at a true tale of unimaginable horror. I want to thank everyone who has listened to the podcast so far. It really means a lot to me. That's doing far better in these early stages than I could have ever imagined. If you like it, go ahead and leave a rating and a review. And tell a friend that might be into this kind of thing. Leave a like on the Facebook page, share an episode link. Small things like that go a lot further than you might think. Today, I have a story for you that will make you check your doors and windows. So without further ado, let's get into the topic of today's story. I hope you enjoy, if that's the right word for it. What makes the thought of being attacked with a hammer so terrifying? For me, it would be the incredible amount of damage that can be done with only a single strike. Shattered bones, pulverized flesh, and incredible pain come to mind when I think of it. No doubt one of the scariest weapons to face. That's not to say that knives, axes, and other melee weapons aren't scary. They certainly are. A hammer, though, seems to be unstoppable, and particularly vicious. Even blocking a blow from a heavy hammer can leave you with a crippled hand or arm for life. This story will tell the tale of what can happen when a maniac unleashes his fury on complete strangers in their own homes. This is a tragic story that would haunt the Denver area for over 3 decades. Aurora in Lakewood, Colorado, 1984. Winter had taken full effect, and it was cold. Snow blanketed the area, and darkness fell fast in the early evening. A small-time burglar goes on a crime spree that would leave many lives and bones shattered in the wake of a brutal rampage that left 4 people dead and several others severely injured. No one saw it coming, and how could they? The residents of these middle-class communities on the outskirts of Denver simply didn't worry about this type of thing. These were quiet neighborhoods with low crime rates, but in January of that year, a monster would emerge and strike terror in the community. His horrifying weapon of choice would be a hammer. The Aurora Hammer Slayer started as a simple thief, stealing small, easily fenced items, but eventually his break-ins would turn violent. As quickly as the attacks began, within weeks they would cease, leading investigators to believe that the killer had left the area, and they were right. Killers don't normally just stop killing all of a sudden, so investigators would begin looking in other areas of the country for similar cases. What they didn't know was the man allegedly responsible for the terrifying crimes had been sitting in prison for over 30 years before they finally discovered who he really was. January 4th, 1984. James Haubenschild had been putting together a mixed tape for a friend's aerobics class. These were the days when it was literally a mixed tape, a magnetic strip that stored audio information wound around opposing reels. It was around 2 a.m. when he finally went to bed, no doubt tired and ready for a good night's rest. He had forgotten to close the garage door and went to join his wife Kimberly, who was already asleep. As they slept in the comfort of their bed on that cold night in the Rockies, a monster lurked through their home, not only looking for valuables, but for victims as well. You see, up to this point, the unknown assailant had only committed petty thefts and burglaries, often only taking small items. Spare change from cars he had broken into, purses, jewelry, things of that nature, things he could easily sell without drawing too much attention to himself. This night would be different, though, and would mark the turning point for this inept criminal. This time, he would bring a weapon with him, and I can probably speak for all of us when I say that, as far as being attacked goes, being attacked with a hammer must be one of the most terrifying situations you could find yourself in. It certainly ranks up there with axes, knives, machetes, and the like. A single blow from a hammer can easily end a life in a split second, or leave a person with permanent, debilitating injuries should they survive. It's a simple weapon that is durable, cheap, requires no maintenance, and can be found just about anywhere, and it's devastatingly effective. It's believed that the intruder entered through that open garage door and made his way into the home. He quietly sneaks into the Haubenschild's bedroom and creeps his way over to James's side of the bed and quickly brings the hammer down onto the left side of the sleeping man's head. In a later interview, James recalls, quote, "I must have tried to wake up and I put my hand up. The first thing I remember was my hand getting really big, hurting. Looking down, my hand was swollen. I saw the hammer and wondered where it came from." At this point, Kimberly is awakened by the commotion as the man turns to her and throws the hammer at her, hitting her in the head. The attacker then took Kim's purse and apparently fled the scene, and after a few moments James was able to get up and would look around the house to make sure the attacker was gone. Fortunately for this young couple, they would survive the attack. James with a fractured skull and Kimberly with a concussion. I read in one article that Kim may have been raped, but I have seen no mention of it in any other articles or news footage, and Kim herself made no mention of it in the short clips I've seen of her. Both, however, would spend decades trying to bury the memories of the attack by a stranger who had shattered their sense of security and peace of mind.
It was the middle of the night 2 weeks ago when a man entered this house through the garage. When he left, the man and woman who live here had been beaten on the head with a hammer. They are Kim and Jim. We withheld their last names. They're convinced their attacker is the same man who killed the 3 members of the Bennett family.
Because basically a hammer was used for one thing, and from what detectives have said, that the person that has done some of the other crimes has been described in the same manner as what I have described. As far as I know, nobody's seen his face. They've just been able to describe the build and the color and such.
Do you have any idea why he broke in here, what his motive was?
I just thought it was money, quick cash or something, because he didn't take any of the rings or jewelry or nothing like that. He did steal her purse, so we thought it was just quick money, but I think he's just, either out to rape or just to hurt people.
I don't sleep much at night anymore, James would say. And because of that, if I hear any noises, I'm kind of up all night. He also reportedly suffers anxiety and fear in public places as well, stating, quote, "It's always there in the back of my mind." Kim Rice, who has since been divorced from James, received a phone call from a police detective to give her some news on the case in 2018. In the over 3 decades since the attack, she had convinced herself that the assailant must be dead. It was her way of coping with the nightmare that she had lived through. Quote, "It was comforting," she said. "I didn't grasp the severity of it because I didn't have a real person or anything to put with this." Upon receiving news that a suspect had been identified by DNA and that police are certain they have the right man, she said, quote, "Now it's sinking in. I think I'll be okay. I think I'll come to grips with that." James and Kim have lived in the realm of nightmares since that night 35 years ago. They sought answers, but instead, they were left with only questions. They had no known enemies and couldn't even begin to speculate on a suspect in their assault. Who did this to them? The attack on the Haubensschilds wouldn't be the only one on that night. Whoever this man was, there was one thing that was clear. He had evidently developed quite a lust for blood. Donna Dixon, a 28-year-old flight attendant at the time, was just arriving home from work when she was attacked as she got out of her car after pulling into her garage. She had apparently been hit in the head with a hammer, and the attacker also slammed her head into one of the wheels of her car repeatedly. Then he raped her and left her to die on the concrete. Several hours later, she managed to get to her feet and make her way into the home and went to bed. It would be almost 24 hours until her boyfriend, Ronald Holm, would find her still in bed and seriously wounded. He called 911 and emergency personnel rushed her to the ER. She would undergo many surgeries, and the doctors believe that exposure to cold temperatures after the attack may have slowed bleeding, helping to save her life. Dixon was gravely injured in the attack, as you can imagine, and would be in a coma for some time afterward. When she finally emerged from the coma, she had to learn how to talk all over again. She would survive, though, undoubtedly traumatized for life by the attack. Ronald and Donna were married in May of that year and remain married to this day. After the attacks on January 4th, it would be almost a week of nervous worry from the residents of the surrounding communities before this hammer-wielding maniac would resurface. Patricia Louise Smith, born September 19, 1933, was a 50-year-old grandmother and interior design business owner. She was described as being very close to family and kind to everyone she met and never spoke a harsh word. She moved from Oshkosh, Nebraska, to be with her daughter Sherry and 2 grandchildren, Amber and Joe, as moral support after Sherry's divorce, while Patricia's husband Oliver stayed in Oshkosh. She would help Sherry take care of the kids, providing rides to and from school, and also help Sherry get back and forth to the bus station. They would all live together in a townhome on Bayard Avenue in Lakewood. On the evening of January 10th, Patricia didn't arrive to pick Sherry up at the usual time, so she waited and waited. Eventually, after some time, Sherry phoned her cousin Valerie to come pick her up, which she did, and the two went to her son Joe's daycare, where she would find both of her children. A friend of Sherry's had apparently taken her daughter Amber to the daycare after school had let out, when Patricia hadn't come to pick Amber up. After retrieving the children, Valerie would then drive Sherry and the kids home, and as they approached, Sherry noticed flickering light coming from Patricia's bedroom window, the light from a TV. Patricia's car was parked in the driveway. The four got out of the car and headed to the front door, with the kids running ahead so they could burst through first. Amber said, "I pushed my way through. I was the first one to run into the room and see her." What she saw was Patricia's lifeless body a few feet from the door, lying on a Winnie the Pooh blanket, arms crossed over her chest, with her head partially covered by the blanket. I can't even imagine what was going through her head at the time, and I'm not even sure she fully understood the gravity of the situation at the time. Quote, "I always thought it was a little strange. She was absolutely posed," Amber said. Pat's jeans had been pulled down, but she was still wearing a sweater and boots. She had been beaten with a blunt object, which investigators believed to be a hammer, and blood was pooled around her head. A hammer was later found near her body. The coroner examined her body and believed she had been struck at least 16 times with the hammer. She had been dead for several hours, with the time of death estimated to be between 1 and 3 p.m. that day. Sherry and Valerie hurried to get the kids out of the house and took them next door to a neighbor's home. The man who lived there rushed over to Patricia's house, and when he returned, he called Lakewood police saying, quote, "There is a woman on the floor dead, and she has been raped." As police and crime scene investigators arrived, the kids watched out of the neighbor's window while personnel buzzed around the property and questioned their mother. "We all fell apart after this happened," Amber said in a later interview. "My grandmother was the glue that held our family together. It was very devastating." Patricia was a strong woman, hardened by the life she lived. When she was a child, her father died in a rodeo when a horse fell on top of him, and after that, her mother sent her to live with her grandparents in South Dakota. She wasn't known to be a complainer. Instead, she always showed a positive outlook on life. In a letter to the Denver Post, which is my main source for this episode, a friend wrote, "Pat was a gentle, sincere woman with soft brown eyes and a slender figure. She knew how hard life could be and why it was important to take the time to laugh. Fast to respond to her friends' needs, she was always available to listen to my mother's problems. Perhaps the person who took her life didn't know all of this about her, but I would like him to. He should realize that no matter what he was feeling when he took Pat's last breath of life, he took something from all of us who loved her. He took her special qualities that touched our lives." The TV in Patricia's bedroom was on, and a receipt from Wendy's was found, leading family to believe that she had been home on her lunch break. It's unclear whether the killer followed her home or cased the house to learn her routine, but there was no evidence of forced entry, leading investigators to believe he had either entered the door freely or he knocked and attacked Patricia when she opened it. There was very little evidence left by the killer. There were no useful fingerprints lifted from the scene. The house hadn't been torn apart, and the only valuables he was believed to have taken were Patricia's necklace and 2 rings from her body. Autopsy reports confirmed the cause of death to be blunt force trauma from repeated hammer strikes to the head, and revealed evidence that she had been sexually assaulted, possibly while unconscious. Investigators didn't know it at the time, but they had taken one piece of evidence that would prove crucial in finding the monster that committed this crime. Not all heroes wear capes, and in this case, it would be a simple act of cutting a piece of carpet containing biological evidence from beneath Patricia's body that would make these investigators the heroes that Patricia's family needed. The coroner had also swabbed semen samples from Patricia's body. DNA technology was still years away, so the evidence collected would be locked up and held in storage for 25 years. The detectives and CSI personnel who worked this case did everything exactly right, and though decades would pass without answers, it would be those small pieces of evidence that would break the case wide open. Bruce and Deborah Bennett had gotten married before he joined the Navy, according to Bruce's mother, Constance. He would serve 4 years stationed at Pearl Harbor from 1976 to 1980 as a sonar analyst. After his service was over, Bruce took Deborah and their daughter Melissa to Aurora, Colorado, and he took a job at a family-run furniture store where Deborah would also gain employment. Constance recalled, quote, "They led a very quiet life. They worked hard and stayed home at night." In 1981, their second daughter, Vanessa, was born, and Bruce enrolled in college. He had a goal of becoming an air traffic controller at the local airport. Sunday, January 15th. Several members of the extended Bennett family would meet up at the newly purchased home of Bruce and Deborah Bennett to have a birthday party for 7-year-old Melissa, who would be turning 8 on Tuesday, the following week. When the party was over, the last guest would leave at around 9 p.m., and they would later report that the garage door was open when they left. This would be the last time family would see them alive. Sometime between midnight and 6 a.m., investigators say a man gained entry into the home, most likely through the open garage. It's believed that Bruce heard the intruder, so he left the bedroom and headed down the stairs where the two would meet, and an epic struggle would ensue. The intruder went at Bruce with the hammer, hitting him at least a few times. They struggled up and down the stairs for some time as Bruce, who was unarmed, fought desperately for his wife and children. He endured many hammer blows that would knock most of us unconscious, yet he continued to fight the intruder, tooth and nail. Investigators believe that eventually Bruce was knocked unconscious, and while down, the attacker went to the kitchen and found a knife. He came back to Bruce and then cut and stabbed him, and ultimately slashed his throat from ear to ear. The autopsy report revealed that Bruce sustained many lethal injuries during the struggle. Bruce fought heroically for his family, but without a weapon, the odds were against him. The intruder then went upstairs toward Deborah's bedroom. He pummeled her with the hammer as she fought for her life as well, and as she lay dying, he raped her. He then went to Melissa's bedroom and struck her with the hammer at least once. An imprint of the embroidery on his shirt would be stamped onto Melissa's pajamas in her own blood. He put her on the floor, then raped her unconscious body, and put her back on the bed when he was done. It's believed that at this time, Bruce, Deborah, and Melissa had already died from their wounds. After the attack on Melissa, the intruder then turned his sights to 3-year-old Vanessa. He swung the hammer several times with all of his might into the right side of her face, shattering her jaw and leaving her with multiple skull fractures. I read one report that stated she had nearly choked to death on bone fragments. After bludgeoning Vanessa, he then took Deborah's purse and left through the front door, where he would dump the contents of the purse nearby. He threw the knife down and fled the scene. All of this for seemingly no reason whatsoever. It's unclear whether he got any money or anything valuable from the purse, and no other items appeared to have been taken. If any good can be seen in this situation, it's the fact that Vanessa would thankfully survive the vicious attack, though her face still bears scars to this day, and she has lived a hard life. I want to play a clip of an interview from 2018 with Vanessa. Some of it was filmed in what looks to be a park in the summer, so there's a lot of insect noise in the background.
She was the youngest victim of one of Colorado's most horrific crimes. Just 3 years old when a monster with a hammer broke into her family's home. Just 3 when that madman caved in her skull with a hammer and left her for dead.
It's possible that she could be left with significant permanent injury. It's too early to tell.
In those first bewildering days in January 1984, her very survival sparked hope in her grandmother.
Vanessa is making such good progress, and she's going to be okay. We thank God.
I don't remember anything at all, honestly. People ask me all the time if I remember things, but I don't.
Today, Vanessa Bennett is okay, but not entirely okay.
I have a metal plate in my forehead. I had frontal lobe issues because I was hitting the hammer. My skull kind of breaks right here. My jaw pretty much is shattered. I had a tracheotomy here. I have a shattered pelvis. But I guess I healed pretty well.
Her childhood was difficult.
I was made fun of in school because my parents were killed. I was made fun of because the hammer man, or whatever you want to call it, was gonna come to my house and hurt everybody when I had slumber parties and stuff. I was made fun of for a long time.
Adulthood has been even harder.
I had issues with my grandmother growing up because of my, anger issues, and I was hurt. Growing up, she was hurt, and I just chose a different path of trying to make things go away.
A couple years ago, she left Colorado for Arizona. For the past 6 months, she's been homeless, living for a time under a bridge. Is it overstating it to say that you live with the ramifications of that day in January 1984
Yes.
every single day of your life?
Yes, it does. I remember a lot of my life, I was angry because why did I have to be the only one that lived? Why did my parents die? They were great people. And then I turned out being a junkie, And I always thought, they were good people. What did they do wrong? They didn't do anything. They were young. They were in their mid-20s.
Are you hopeful about the future?
I am. I have big things planned, and I know it sounds like it's a little late because I'm 38 years old, but it's never too late,
The morning after the attack on the Bennett family, co-workers of Bruce and Deborah would call Bruce's mother, Constance, to see if she knew anything. She then made her way to the Bennett house, where she would discover the body of Bruce at the bottom of the stairs. I can't even pretend to imagine what that must be like. Bruce, Deborah, and Melissa all lay dead, but somehow little Vanessa was clinging to life by only a thread. Just as in the case of Patricia Smith, the investigators of the Bennett family crime scene did a very commendable job at collecting evidence and performing due diligence. They did everything exactly right. They even extracted a chunk of concrete from the garage for footprint analysis, which would match footprints found in the Donna Dixon crime scene. As in the case of Patricia, they would collect semen samples and part of a blanket containing biological evidence from the Bennett home. Again, they didn't fully appreciate what they had at the time, but we'll soon see the impact that these small pieces of evidence would have on this case many years later. After the horrific attack on the Bennett family, the killer seemingly vanished. He had committed 4 brutal attacks in the span of just 12 days in the cold January of 1984. But serial killers, as we know, don't simply stop killing in the vast majority of cases. A man with this much pent-up rage can't help himself. It's like a drug that he's become dependent on. Just one more fix is all he needs. Police had believed at the time that the fight with Bruce must have injured the killer, perhaps causing him to lay low for a while, and maybe even change his MO. Maybe now, he would bring a gun with him for future attacks. The truth, however, is a very different story. The case of the Aurora Hammer Slayer would run cold. He left very little usable evidence for detectives to develop any viable suspects with, at least using the technology of that time. Detectives working the case would eventually call on the help of the FBI to assist with the investigation. On January 24th, FBI Special Agent Ronald Walker would be the man who would assist by reviewing crime scene photos and evidence left by the perpetrator, then developing a profile of the type of person that should be considered. Some key points of the general profile developed by Agent Walker are as follows. He believed that all of the hammer attacks that had occurred in the area around that time were committed by the same person. This would include the Haubenschild, Donna Dixon, and Patricia Smith attacks. The suspect would have impulse control problems and would most likely be an alcoholic or use drugs frequently. Due to the weapon of choice, he thought the suspect wouldn't have the resources to buy a gun, instead using weapons of opportunity that could be easily found in his place of employment or cheaply bought, or possibly found in the residences of the victims. Based on hammers being the weapon of choice, the killer was most likely a construction worker or employed in a similar field where he would have easy access to hammers. The suspect most likely lived in the area and traveled along the Alameda corridor to and from work, which runs very close to every crime scene and was a zone of active construction in the area. All of the attacks, except the Haubenschild and Dixon attacks, were committed 6 days apart, which may be due to the suspect's available time off. He could have been working 6 long days per week, and during his off time, he would be able to commit these crimes without being noticed. He was an unsophisticated burglar and hadn't developed the knowledge necessary to pick locks or cut through glass windows, and would be unable to fence high-value items. The suspect's criminal record would probably contain several charges of burglary, trespassing, and possibly car theft. The suspect, instead of stalking his victims, would have simply went house to house, checking doorknobs and windows to see if they were unlocked, and if they were, that's where he would strike. Agent Walker believed that the carrying of a hammer by the suspect was no coincidence. At some point during a burglary, the suspect was probably confronted and scared away by the resident, and from that moment forward, he would bring a weapon. Eventually, the motive turned from petty theft into rage-fueled attacks with a sexual motivation. He felt empowered by carrying a hammer, and would then begin blitz attacking his victims to fulfill his sexual desires. Walker didn't know it at the time, but his profile of the suspect in this case would prove to be surprisingly accurate. The case, though pursued fervently by detectives, would remain cold from 1984 into the foreseeable future, but with advances in DNA technology also came hope from the lead detective in this case. So it would be that in 2001, biological evidence would be submitted for DNA analysis. After developing a good genetic profile, the Arapahoe County District Attorney would file charges against John Doe for the murders of Patricia Smith and the Bennett family. In 2010, with more advances in DNA technology, the murders of Patricia Smith and the Bennett family were confirmed to have been committed by the same person. But on July 10, 2018, the Colorado Bureau of Investigation were notified of a match for the DNA profile. Alexander Christopher Ewing, who was serving a 40-year sentence for assault and attempted murder in a Nevada state prison, had matched the DNA profile perfectly. A state law went into effect in 2013, requiring mandatory DNA collection of inmates that were convicted for specific crimes, but the prison system would resist the mandate for 5 years. Eventually, though, they would take a buccal swab from Ewing and submit the results into the national database, and within 3 days, detectives from the Aurora PD would travel to Nevada to interview Ewing. After obtaining another DNA sample from Ewing and double confirming the match, an arrest warrant was issued, and he would be charged for the crimes committed against Patricia Smith and the Bennett family. Ewing had several run-ins with the law over the years, being arrested in both California and Florida in 1979 for burglary. Also in 1979, he was arrested for grand theft and burglary in Arizona. In 1980, he was arrested yet again for another burglary, and again in 1982 for trespassing and burglary. On January 27, 1984, 11 days after the Bennett murders, Ewing entered the residence of a Kingman, Arizona man and nearly beat him to death with what was described as a rock or a chunk of asphalt. Ewing was discovered by police hiding in a bush nearby, and he would be arrested for the assault, charged, and incarcerated. Due to jail overcrowding, he was sent to Washington County Jail in Utah to await trial. While being transported back to Arizona by officials on August 9th, he escaped custody while the officials had made a stop at a gas station. On that same day, he entered the home of Christopher and Nancy Berry and bludgeoned both of them severely with an axe handle. After eventually being caught, he was charged for those attacks and ultimately convicted of 2 counts each of assault and attempted murder. He was sentenced to serve up to 70 years in prison and would be eligible for parole after 40. It's no coincidence that the Hammer Slayer attacks stopped in Aurora. My theory is that the fight with Bruce and the high profile of the crime scared Ewing away from Aurora, so he left and continued his crimes elsewhere, but thankfully got caught. The Aurora Hammer Slayer's crime spree was over, but in the 34 years that followed, horrific memories remained with the survivors. They and their families have lived with fear all this time, not knowing who could have committed the savage attacks. Investigators are 100% confident they have the right man, and so am I after taking a dive into this case. Ewing has been fighting extradition to Colorado since he was charged, and as of at least October 2019, he is still in the Carson City Correctional Facility in Nevada. And that will do it for episode 3. I want to thank you again for listening. I'd like some case suggestions, so if you have one that you think would be interesting, drop by the website or the Facebook page. Until you hear from me again, remember, keep your doors locked